Hello, and welcome to Unco, a podcast about what's unusual in tech. I'm your host, Timothy Buck. My guest this week is Ben Bajarin. Ben is the founder of Techpinions and principal at Creative Strategies, where he leads primary research into consumer technology. We discussed Apple's strategy to position the iPad for education, not necessarily the education market, the possibility of talent drain from Facebook, positive movement toward diversity in tech, and changes in venture capital. If you'd like to hear more episodes like this, help me keep the show around by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/uncofm. It's kind of a crazy day here, actually. I'm recording from my house, and they're doing construction like right outside our window. So I had to move into the bathroom and shut the door and like stack up a bunch of boxes and stuff to
Well,
so
yeah, at least, you don't have to quite deal with that. I deal with it a similar way or different way, because I was doing a call with Lenovo today, and I had one of my chickens was right outside crowing, so I had to make sure that they're not necessarily sitting there on a conference call listening to roosters crow in the background. Some people like it, but
that's funny. Yeah. You may hear some, like, the whole house shakes sometimes with what they're doing out there. So you may hear something, but
yeah, it's no biggie.
But yeah. So if you want to jump right in, for any of my listeners who don't know, what is it that you do with Creative Strategies and Techpinions and all of that stuff?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I get it a lot, honestly. I think sometimes the analyst role in the industry, is misunderstood. Every time this question comes up, like literally the first thing I think about is that dude from Office Space that's like, so what would you say you do here?
Right.
And it's like you got to explain, and and it's interesting because the industry analyst, which is very different than kind of your buy side, sell side analysts. Typically, we give more color and perspective than we do, what might be more done on the financial side, which is make, stock calls, do financial analysis, look at, the numbers of a company, etc. We have to do some of that because I do a lot of work with Wall Street because of the color that I bring in terms of context. So this is the best way I can explain it to you. And unfortunately, this analogy might get lost on some people who don't watch sports. But if you watch sports, football, baseball, basketball, you always have your play-by-play announcer, and then you have like what they call either the analyst or the color announcer. Like ESPN has a lot of these, the former sports people that are the analysts. So they're the ones that kind of give you the experience, the deeper perspective behind like what just happened with a play or what's going on with the team. So they're doing that analysis, but they're doing it from a viewpoint of expertise. And that's essentially like what we do for tech. We've got deep expertise in the areas that we study. So my role is to study consumer markets as a whole, consumer technology. Because my firm is small, I'm able to be super broad. So myself and my colleague Carolina, for example, we look at like anything that we want. There's no part of the consumer tech landscape that's off limits for us to study or go to conferences at or sit through briefings with executives and companies that are in that space. Bigger firms like Gartner and IDC, who usually we get lumped in because we kind of all do similar things, and I go to all the same things and executive things that IDC and Gartner folk go to. But typically they might have one analyst and all they do is one thing. Like they might just do smartphones, or they might just do PCs, or they might just do cloud, or the just smart home. And so they kind of have their own little buckets of expertise. We're small, and so while we're known for certain things specifically, like we try to maintain a very, very wide net of what we study, and that just lets us be more broad and diverse. But the root point is that it's coming from a position of expertise. You spend a lot of time studying, looking at one market, gathering as much information as you can, learning as much as you can, and to just maintain that kind of expertise on that one thing. And so you're bringing that outside expertise to subject matter for, whatever it is you're working on. In this case, we work with a lot of companies in the tech industry. We work with, like I said, Wall Street. I work with venture capitalists on market strategy and companies that they're looking at doing due diligence on, because I'm known for having an expertise in this one particular area. So that's kind of how I can best kind of explain it, if you will. And then there's the whole like making of the sausage of how all of that's done. But that at a high levels is sort of how I'd explain like my role in the industry. And in your question about Techpinions is, before I started Techpinions in 2011, the broadest way, or the more common way that people like me, analysts, got exposure was we'd get quoted by the media quite often. Places like New York Times, Wall Street Journal were friendly with all of those writers, and so they would be running a story on something, Apple, Microsoft, Intel, Qualcomm, etc., you name it, and they'd say, hey, I need an outside source to just provide some commentary, and they'd quote us, and quotes were great, right? But you get like one sentence, maybe a paragraph as a part of this whole article. And I just wanted to control my voice more, things I was saying about the industry, be able to say more and do my own sort of broader color and control the narrative of what my opinion or the vantage point I was coming from as an analyst with expertise in one area. And so we decided to start Techpinions as kind of the hub where we write long-form commentary on the industry on lots of different subject matters. If anybody sort of reads, I cover a lot of stuff and write a lot about a lot of different subjects. But it really, the root was just, I wanted a place, you could call it a blog, but I wanted a place where I could control my voice, the things I wanted to say, points I wanted to make, and it wasn't just one paragraph in some other journalist's article.
Yeah, that makes sense. So back into creative strategies for a second, what would be an example of how a company like an Apple or Microsoft or Amazon would how you would work with them? Like, what would they request from you?
So a lot of times it's we participate in sort of these big kind of offsite summits, for example, where they'll come to us with their top however many burning questions, and our goal is to help them answer those questions. So sometimes these are very hard questions. Sometimes they're ones that don't have pretty answers for the company that we're talking to. So a lot of times, because we do have a wide net, right? And for anybody who's listening, right, that you work at one company, you're often very, very focused on that company, that product, your market, your head's down. You don't really take the time to kind of look out at the broader world and just kind of see what else is happening that might impact you. And so we're very frequently brought in kind of in those contexts, which is, what are we missing? What are we not seeing? What do we need to see that we don't see? Feedback on their own strategy, feedback on sort of their own kind of product market that they're going, places that we might see, because we do a lot of competitive analysis, for example. So like when like Apple's education event that just happened, for example. So we write up a competitive intelligence report that we say, this is what they did. Here's the strategic implications to something like Chrome, for example, or Windows. These are the areas where those said companies might be vulnerable, might still have opportunities or not have to worry. And so they read a lot of our competitive analysis reports as well as a part of the service that we provide. And everybody's just kind of reading the same thing. They're reading our take on this, what it means to the industry as a whole, what it means to markets, and then very specifically what it means to certain competitors. But sometimes, the follow-up of that is they want to have a conversation, maybe get a little bit more of our feedback and what it means to them, this company specifically, from a strategic standpoint. We also do a lot of primary research, so we average right now between roughly about 14 primary research studies every year. So we're doing one a month, basically, is kind of what it breaks down. And so we generate a lot of data, but our goal with that is to not just walk into them and say, X% of the market wants this. It's to really dig into the nuances and the deeper insights of that data, and then we help make that relevant to them, right? Apple's market strategy when looking at our data is going to be very different than Microsoft's or Lenovo's or Google's, for example, and just help them really understand how to take that research and internalize it and use it in actionable ways. So like I said, it's pretty broad because we are diverse. We fit a lot of strategic planning parts of their business. We feed into marketing as well. They'll ask us, for example, like what what some of the feedback on their marketing should be. Sometimes they'll test ideas with us. So like I said, we're pretty broad. We're super diverse. So they bring us in for a lot of different things, but those are some of the common things that the industry looks to us to help them do.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think for me, it's interesting because I feel like I don't really know very many people who are in that type of business. I don't know. I know I've met a lot of people who write a lot about tech or who read a lot about it or who work at some of these companies, but you kind of have a unique role in that you're at the tech events, you're also deep in the Wall Street side of things, and you're also deep in the research side of it. And so it's definitely a unique perspective. And I find it really helpful to read and follow along with.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I've always liked your commentary on stuff that I'm writing. There's really not a lot of people that do what we do. It's a very small circle of analysts at our level that have both the exposure as well as the inroads to the execs at all the top companies. So you're right. It is a unique position. It's one that, like I said, there's not a lot of people that do it. But it's super interesting for me because I really like looking at a lot of stuff. I find it intellectually stimulating to kind of study a lot of different things. I mean, I used to be at companies. I used to, make products and consumer facing products and things like that. And it was great. Like I enjoyed, but I get bored, with just one thing over time. That's the reality of it. So I enjoy kind of having a really wide web to just chase and just really try to wrestle with some of the intellectual stuff. And honestly, like I really enjoy the executive engagement that we get. Like we constantly get feedback compared to the other analysts that they work with, that we're one of the few that aren't afraid to walk in and tell them what they need to hear. We don't just say this is that you're all great, just glowingly great. Like we say, like, look, these are some real challenges, and we hit them sometimes in the gut with realities that they might either not want to internalize or want to be blind to. And so they appreciate that. They may not, again, always agree with us. Sometimes there's some wonderfully heated debates that happen in these executive conversations that we're in. But they find it helpful that we're not afraid, to speak our mind and tell them what we think they really need to hear. We do it in a constructive way. I don't criticize them. I do it in a way that's helpful, but they find it refreshing that we're able sometimes to just really lay on them what they really need to hear, get them out of their little bubble and challenge them in ways that will make them better as a company.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could see how that is a valuable service for them. So I guess moving on a little bit, the Apple event it just happened, and it was an education-focused event, and everything that I read and saw about it seemed like Apple was trying to kind of downplay it by, having it not out here in San Francisco or in the Bay Area, and then not live streaming it and making it very clear that this is an education-specific event. And then all the write-ups that I've seen have been relatively negative about what their strategy is with education, even though they're doing a few interesting things. How do you feel about their strategy, what they're doing, and do you think that? I guess I'll just start with that question.
Yeah. No, and you're right, and I think there's two parts to this too, and I totally understand where some of the public commentary is coming from. I mean, this is, I wrote this up in kind of my brief explanation of this week, but in many ways, the educational market is actually more complex than the enterprise market, and certainly more complex than the consumer market. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate that nuance, that it's actually a really, really complex and challenging market. It's often also super heterogeneous. So, in a lot of institutions that we talk to that are deploying, north of thousands of machines, they very frequently they span the gamut. They've got Macs, they've got Windows PCs, they got iPads, they got Chromebooks. So, there might be some that deploy more of one of those than other, but the reality is they are supporting a very heterogeneous environment. They're also making very different decisions on software management, how those devices are managed and deployed, how they're secured. So it's really it's way more diverse than enterprise is in terms of some of those fundamental systems that they use for both management and deployment, as well as the services that they're paying for as an educational institution that might be online services or educational services or things like that. And they try to weave all of that in, to one environment. So it's a very, very different market. And I think a lot of people just don't understand the education market in general. And so they kind of get lost on, well, it's always price that matters. And that's true, but price is not the only factor that impacts a decision by an IT manager or people making decisions for their entire district, for example. In terms of Apple trying to downplay it, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. They probably didn't live stream it just because they were out of school. That would have been maybe a bit tricky to set up, and they might have had to jump through some larger, hoops to be able to provide a live stream for that, given that they're on a school campus versus a public environment like Moscone or Buena Vista, or even their own campus where they can control more of that. And second is that it made sense why it's at this one particular school, in that this was a very large school, one of the largest in the country. And they were engaging in a lot of projects. That area is kind of becoming a hub for this distinguished educators program that they're doing. So they're centralizing stuff in that area. Strategically, like why, I'm not sure. Some people had said, well, there's a lot of very specific kind of Chrome-ish initiatives, right, in terms of a center that Google was focusing on in that area. So there might be that area is kind of a hotbed for some of these things. But I think the big picture takeaway, is really just that Apple is, I still think, taking baby steps to how they start to position iPad within education, really more about as an educational tool. That's really up to both the educator or the student to use, because the reality is that's the case, right? Anybody who has a kid in school, that while they might be given a Chromebook, they do not have to use that Chromebook. The institution is happy with you using whatever you want. My wife's a teacher here in the school, Bay Area school district, and she can use whatever she wants to come across and teach. She could use an iPad, she could use a Windows machine, she could use a Chromebook. It's completely up to her. So it's a very diverse environment. So I think what Apple is trying to do is just get these champions to embrace the product, take iPad, go and do things that you can't do with other machines, whether it's a Chromebook or a Windows notebook or even a Mac, and use these as showcase examples that other people get excited about and say, "Oh, I didn't know you could do that," and then say like, "This is, you got to do this on iPad." So I was talking to a friend who deploys over 10,000 devices in a school district in the South, and it was interesting because he was not coming back from this thinking like, oh, this is Apple's going to take the cake. But his takeaway I thought was really interesting, where he said, Apple's probably is positioning for this is not that iPad is for the education market, right? And when I say market, saying knowing all of the complex nuances that go on to say that they're going to tackle a market. But really his point, which I thought was interesting, is that they're positioning iPad for education. And I think it's a very different positioning of the product to say it's for education than it's for the education market, because that sort of changes the buyer, right? If you're saying it's for the education market, then you're hoping to sell to, the buyer who's going to deploy these in a one-to-one environment, at which point cost is a factor. If you're saying it's for for education, then anyone can buy that product, teacher, student, etc., and go and use that in their environment if they want, and do their education on it. So while I don't disagree that Apple's going to try to make some inroads with iPad in the education market through things they're doing with ClassKit and homework and the classroom management, like those are all clearly for the market. But I think that instead of leaning in on that, right, the same way that Chromebooks are, I think by taking this direction of it's for education, they'll win into some of those market conversations They still have to do more. No no doubt about that. In the software and services side, this was a step in the right direction for classroom management, homework management, etc. But I think, like I said, this positioning of it, and that's really kind of what I've been thinking more about lately, is just how iPad is positioned within education, not necessarily like how it's positioned within that market, coming from the context of the educational buyer, the institutional buyer, that mindset.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing that I noticed, it seems like we're very focused on education in the U.S. How is the market different in Europe or Asia or South America, where there's an education market there as well, for sure, but I haven't heard anyone talking about how does Apple even compete there at all, or is are they better, worse?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the U.S. market tends to be, I would say, just a little bit more standardized in some of the hardware that they can use. And the other reason that the U.S. market kind of gets a little bit more attention is just because there is a large portion of Chromebooks that go into public schools in particular. So very, very many, a good number of public school districts are moving to one-to-one with Chrome, so they're standardizing on Chrome. Now, again, they still support other things, but in terms of what they're handing out to a kid who may not have a computer at home or needs to be able to use a computer to engage with the software that they're using, or the homework apps and things that they're using. So this market is a little bit more of a Chrome stronghold, if you will. So I think that's one of the reasons why it gets a little bit more attention. There is a lot more diversity, possibly even more complexity in other markets, where each kind of region within a district can make very different decisions. They're sort of a little bit more isolated versus where, like here in California, for example, each district's broken up into regions, but the whole of California around public institutions is sort of top down, deciding, hey, we're going to deploy Chromebooks, we're going to buy Chromebooks. There's a lot more variance in other markets to have different decisions. There's just smaller deployments is what it comes down to. A lot of the big organizations out there that are in a couple of different big markets country-wise, in some cases the country's making the decision. So it's not that it's not a public or an institutional buyer the same way that a district buyer here or IT manager here in the States has. It's actually something that's determined at a country level. So politics come into that, right? So it's just super different, and so it varies. And so, like I said, that's why I think it's hard to say, hey, I'm going to tackle the education market like the same. Like, you just can't say that the same way that you might say I'm going after enterprise, and that's a generic blank statement, if you know what I mean. To say that I'm going after the education market, and that's why I say it's complex, it just means so many different things, and there really isn't one strategy that's going to work for that. That's why I say going after the education use cases and hoping that you might get one kid or one teacher to showcase these examples around just how iPad's the best tool in education for things like creativity and creation and some of those things. Like that's why I think it's an easier message for them to lean on and start to get some of the low-hanging fruit while they continue to create the software and services and go deeper down things like homework and Class Kit and the classroom stuff. That's really needed to kind of manage a whole classroom. But that, again, someone can be fully standardized on Google Classroom or stuff that Windows is doing and still use an iPad. Like, that's the thing, right? You're not locked out from using an iPad. So because it's so heterogeneous, like I said, it really comes down to the decision of the end user in this case to make it to decide on what product works best for them. And that's why, again, I go back to Apple saying iPad is best for education, is kind of the thing that they can lean on and have some differentiation and not necessarily have to do all of the same hoops they're going to have to jump through for going after education market as a strategy.
Yeah, and that seems to be a better fit with their strong suits as well. They've never they tend to be better at selling to the end user of the device because the usability improvements and the little things that Apple does that makes things more fun to use or more consistent in ways that some of their competitors don't, affect the end user in ways that they don't affect an IT manager or somebody who's deploying it to thousands and thousands of people. We saw that in the enterprise market as well, where Apple was creating these devices for the end user, but not really doing all the work necessary to make it really easy to deploy it to the whole enterprise, and that's it
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah, and and it was interesting because I remember as iPhone was really ramping, it was like we talked to IT managers and they were just like they hated it. They're like, I hate that it's Apple devices are notoriously difficult to manage, but yet all of my employees are like, hey, I got an iPhone, I need you to support it, and so their lives were miserable. And to some degree, there's a little bit of that sentiment, but as you could see, like Apple partnered with IBM and they started to bring more management and MDM tools and made it easier for IT. So that's almost, while there's still some sentiment there's still some obviously hardcore stuck in the old school, IT mentalities at really big legacy organizations for it's still just a little challenging to support Macs. But overall, like in the past 3 to 4 years, like that whole Apple devices are hard to manage and blah, 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 and it's a headache, that argument's almost all gone away. So now you could say, all right, well, is the same strategy going to play out in education where the student or the teacher comes to their IT manager and says, hey, look, I need to be able to run more stuff on this. I'm finding it a more valuable educational tool. And they kind of get these champions, right, of iPad. And then the IT guys say, all right, well, we'll figure out how to support it more. I mean, in most cases they can, but there's still some hiccups there. And then as Apple services get better and remote management might work with other software that they're using and plug in better, maybe again, they take this kind of Trojan horse. So I sort of like use this analogy. I did this in this piece I wrote this week where I said, iPhone was the thing that really kind of turned the tide for Apple and enterprise. So maybe iPad is that thing. It's not going to be iPhone, but maybe iPad plays a similar Trojan horse strategy into education as the teachers and as the students kind of buy into this vision about how it is the best tool for their educational environment and the things that they want to do. And that's really what I think this homework video that I linked to in this piece was just that it was saying, everybody, this group came in and did this like knockout job with this project that they did using iPad to create all these things, and that other kids look at that and go, oh man, I can create something like that. Like they just didn't know that a tool existed. And then, and then Apple gets even more well positioned there. So that's, again, you got to take what Apple's doing at a long game. It doesn't mean they're going to have all these short-term wins. It's just about building that foundation. But like I said, I think iPad's kind of the similar end user Trojan horse strategy that they want to try to bring into the education markets the same way that iPhone was with enterprise.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I wasn't quite clear on what they were trying to do, but it seems to fit in with their core competencies and like what they're really good at. But I'm still not sure whether or not it'll work, but it makes sense now.
Yeah, no, and I agree. Like I said, nobody thinks that this is, the say all and end all, and I don't think Apple would agree with that either. I think they're just moving in a direction. They're kind of taking the long haul, or the long view for the strategy, and this is step one of what needs to be, if they're serious, a multi-year big investment strategy on iPad and education.
Yeah. So I guess kind of moving away from Apple for a second, yesterday I was reading the BuzzFeed piece that quoted Andrew Bosworth from Facebook. Did you see that?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think of what's going on with Facebook and that post in particular?
Well, I mean, I think there's two things that I think are important things to watch if you're sort of observing this. The one is the external, which is just what's happened with Facebook as a product and what using that product is like for everyday people, and obviously there's a privacy conversation that's coming into this and gaining steam and generating some awareness. So there's kind of the what happens to the end user? Do they start using Facebook less? Do they feel like they're just not having as good of a time on Facebook? So, they quit it entirely, which is not something I believe. But what does the end kind of user do? Because, if you looked at that piece, like one of the things that they said is, we're going to make these decisions because we're going to grow, and we're not necessarily, going to be worried about the implications of these decisions as we grow, right? In some cases, and most companies, to be honest with you, like we do a lot of work with a lot of these companies that we're talking about, and I'm continually surprised at how often they have not thought through all the different elements of the implications of their product. It's not a skill set. Like thinking through every possible scenario of an outcome is not something many people are good at. I get that, but it's also something that rarely I think is employed when doing some of this product stuff. But I think you've kind of got all right. Well, great. So people knew that they were making decisions that may or may not have great outcomes, and yes, it's good to talk about it, which is kind of his point, right? He didn't necessarily believe some of the things. He just wanted to make sure that people were thinking through some of the implications.
Right, yep.
But then there's the flip side of this that I think is interesting, that came out of this, which is what happens with employee morale. Part of the takeaway from that piece was that folks within Facebook were having to convince themselves that what they were doing was good for the world, because you're a part of this demographic, right? But with millennials, like one thing is that you don't want to work on stuff that you think is making the world worse. And so what happens if, really good employees within Facebook just are like, you know what, we can't come back for this. Like what we've created is terrible, and it's lost meaning and it's lost value, and they don't agree with either the vision, or they think the vision has changed, or the product has moved too far away from that vision that it's unrecoverable. Now, you could see a lot of really smart people leave Facebook, and and the reality is, like, this is like the one thing I always watch is what happens with talent drain, because that's the first indication that a company is really going to either struggle for a long time, or it's just the beginning of the downward spiral. Like we watched this with Snap, for example, and we saw a lot of really smart people leave Snap right after not too long after the IPO. And that gave me worry about the company when some really good product people, leave and go somewhere else, because there's no shortage of opportunity for the best talent at an organization. And so if you get this talent drain in Facebook, which is possible, again, if people believe that what they're working on doesn't have value or is making the world worse, like they don't want to stay there for that, right? So that's where I think that's the one big question for me is, with all of this that's going on, like what's happening inside with morale with Facebook, and are some of their best talent looking to go somewhere else where they can make a better contribution or work on something that's more meaningful if they've lost the vision. So that's why, like, you hear things like this, you see things like this that come up from discussions from behind the curtain of these companies, and those are the kind of things that I look for as a signal of, all right, how worried should we be if morale is going downward? And so this was just kind of one of those things that might suggest that there are some concerns and issues around morale there. Doesn't necessarily mean that what I'm saying is going to happen, but just that's one thing to watch for.
I completely agree. That was actually it was like you were reading my notes. So, and along the same lines, this same thing seemed to have happened with Uber last year, with all the craziness that went on at Uber. Do you see this as big of a challenge for Facebook as last year was for Uber, or is it a different scale?
Well, I mean, I definitely think it's a different scale. I mean,
Okay.
Facebook has unprecedented reach as a company. So there's sort of the impact of Facebook on cultures and society is just far greater than, some scandals that go on inside of Uber from a culture standpoint. But that it doesn't change this meta point that we're making just about how much morale and culture matters and how much that's tied to public perception. Because that was really, I think, one of the interesting things around, this issue with Uber, and to some degree it was with Snap as well, when people were being super down on the IPO and the company's stock started going downward from what it was. Like, that impacts morale. Like, you can't ignore that there were people there who were kind of hoping that Snap was the next big thing, and when it became clear that nobody believed that, they're kind of like, oh shoot, then maybe I'm questioning my own judgment, and I shouldn't be here, and I should go somewhere else. So I think you can make similar points about Facebook, but again, that this is at a very different scale, and this isn't necessarily sexual harassment stuff like going on. Like, this is legitimate, like, negative impact on the world.
Right. Yeah.
That's a very different scale that they're dealing with.
Yeah. At Uber, it was the culture of the employees was not good, and here it's what Facebook as a company's like strategy and product is doing is not good. It's a different thing entirely.
Yeah. No, and that's, like I said, to me, that's the one like thing that I've always said is, like, if it goes sour for morale, where they just feel like, what we're doing's making the world worse, like that's worse off for them, because again, that's the thing that really starts to lead to talent drain. And again, like, it's, you live out here, like, it is such a competitive environment out here. There's no shortage of significant opportunities for top talent in this area. And so it's not hard for Facebook guys to go and do something that they believe more in. And that goes all the way down. Like, you don't have to be a top talent. Like, if you just worked at Facebook and had any kind of somewhat management or product level, like, you're going to be able to get a job anywhere you want. And I think that's the thing, is just, like I said, is to watch for that, how that impacts morale, and what does that lead to in talent, because that's kind of the first really bad signal that structurally, a company might either, again, have some troubles, or it's the beginning of a real downward trend.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I've been watching for that here, just in like the people that I meet. I definitely saw that with Uber for sure. People who worked there would, not mention where they work when you ask them what they do, or they take it off of their Twitter bio or whatever, because they were at least in this area ashamed to say, like, it wasn't something that they were really proud of. And like you're saying, if these people have a lot of different options, they can go almost anywhere they want. And at some point, unless they're really tied down with RSUs that haven't vested yet, they may leave.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, like I said, it's something we watch for. I don't think it's something that we can say is happening yet, but it's one of those things that, like, that's a signal. So,
yep. So, I always round out an episode with this question: what is one thing that you find unusual in tech right now?
So what is? I mean, I'm not sure that unusual is kind of the right word. I mean, again, I've been in this industry a long time, so we've seen a lot of stuff. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that I could say is new and or unusual would be new to some people, but it's not, new to
right.
me. I mean, I do think the biggest thing coming, or that is positive, which again, I don't think is unusual, I think it's a good thing, is just this discussion we're having on diversity. I was in the first bubble. I was doing startups during that first bubble, and I mean, it was bad. I mean, like, stuff you'd hear about, parties and stuff that's going on is worse than stuff you're hearing now. It just didn't have the same publicity. So it was a really, obviously, truly male dominated early .com cycle, and it started off that way, and to some degree, there's still pockets of that, but I think this conversation we're having on diversity and gender balance is really healthy. Social media has been the thing, honestly, that makes this possible. We didn't have the ability to amplify the voice of, someone who was oppressed in some way like we do today, and I think that's been, a positive thing for social in general. But that's a big difference, is just kind of how we can have voices be amplified in this modern era that we didn't have before, which is a really healthy way to kind of keep people and the industry accountable. So again, not that that's unusual, that's new. And I think that's really interesting and important to us as a whole. And I also think that there's some really interesting changes coming on, the venture side. It's so one new thing is, like, if we just want to talk about what's unusual, is that companies are staying private longer.
Oh yeah.
And I think this has some really interesting implications on venture. So you're already hearing that, VCs are now raising funds that are well north of $1 billion, because the typical returns that they're hoping for their LPs is generally like a 5 to 7 year return. And if that means it's going 8 and 10, then they need to wait longer. They need to maybe put more money in other rounds. That I think is super interesting, because the whole structure of venture then now is starting to change in some ways. That's kind of challenging, right? Furthermore, like if we don't have Facebook's, size companies anymore that IPO in terms of scale, and that means that we're also now talking about more small to mid cap IPOs, and a lot of companies aren't raising money with a small to mid cap kind of IPO potential, right? They're raising it with Facebook scale types of opportunities. So it's a really interesting dynamic. That market by itself, I think, is now starting to see some trends that they had not seen before, and are having to make some adjustments within the modern world. So again, not to say that that's unusual, because both those things I talked about are new, and that's just the new reality. And I expect, sort of that to go. So those are, I guess, a few things that kind of come top of mind.
Yeah, that's really cool. So where can people find you on the internet?
So Twitter's the easiest place, because pretty much everything I write and publish is found on Twitter. So I'm just at Ben Bajarin on Twitter. The site that I started, Techpinions, is an easy place to kind of see more of what I write. We have a subscription part of that site where the bulk of my analysis is published to subscribers only. But every now and then I do sort of public columns. But easiest way to see kind of everything that I've written and am saying is Twitter. It's sort of the central way I kind of get my ideas out and stuff, and link to stuff that I've written. So at Ben Bajarin on Twitter.
Yeah, and I'll add that to the show notes, and also that the article that you were mentioning earlier when we were talking about Apple in education. I'll link that as well.
Cool.
And you all can find Unco at unco.fm on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also stay up to date with my writing over at timothybuck.me or by following me on Twitter at timothybucksf. Thanks again for coming on the show, Ben.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime.